Welcome. I'm Carmen Colangelo, Dean of the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts, and I'm very excited to kick off this special symposium this morning called Decoys and Depictions, Images of the Digital. I want to start by welcoming all of you to Weill Hall, to our newly renovated campus, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But first I want to recognize all of our speakers that have come from other cities across the USA. We're very excited. I had an opportunity last night to interact with some of you at the Desley Gallery last night. That was a fantastic opening and an exhibition that really sets the tone for this symposium, especially because the topic itself is so provocative. To see the actual work in real life, since we're dealing with the idea of decoys and depictions of various types, real and physical and maybe not. It was great to begin with that. I also want to thank our students for being here and our faculty for their contributions, and most especially, of course, want to recognize and thank our host who has put incredible amount of work and thought into the symposium to bring such a relevant topic in her third year here at Washington University in St. Louis and part of the Sam Fox School, to bring together, as we're going to talk a little bit more about the collaboration of the school, to bring the faculty, the students, the staff, all of us together in such a collaborative way. I want to recognize Constance Vale. Yeah. An amazing job, an amazing effort, and as far as the Sam Fox School goes, I had a chance to talk to some of our guests last night about the Sam Fox School itself, and I just want to give you a little bit of background because it's also an opportunity maybe to think about some of the opportunities, and of course for me to sort of tell a little bit of history of the school. So going way back to this is true, 1879, the College of Art began, and the College of Art founded, then was the School of Art, the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, which was the city museum in St. Louis. So one of the things I want you to know, the school was one of the first art schools to found a university museum, and the museum that you're going to see, the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, that features our permanent collection that has been recently renovated, originally designed by Fumiko Maki and now added on to by Karen Timberlake, is the first art museum west of the Mississippi River. St. Louis at the time was the fourth largest city, so it makes sense. It was also the home of the fashion district, and there's still a very strong fashion design and fashion culture here. The architecture program, founded in 1905, is the College of Architecture, has had a great history, and it's the not only a program that really designed the model of the BA and MArch 3 program. It was a pioneer of that program, as well as starting one of the first urban design programs in the country in 1960. We have a rich history of both art and architecture, and the Sam Fox School comes together in 2006 to unite in an interdisciplinary collaborative way the schools of art, architecture, and the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. What you're seeing here for the first time and really just opening this fall is the new facilities. This building, designed by Karen Timberlake, is 85,000 square feet. It's designed with this central court, Keener Court, and this great, beautiful living wall as an idea to really bring our schools together and connect the disciplines. Every floor in the building has been thought through in terms of its relationship between the practices of art, architecture, design. Through the center court, we bring light, natural light into the north studio, so south studios in art. And these are 30 MFA studios that you're looking at to the south. Program is run by Patricia Olynyk, and then also to the north, we have the architecture studios that have the beautiful view onto Tisch Park, looking over the sculpture garden, and there are 144 desks for architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture, our graduate programs. And Monica Rivera is the chair of that program, and Derek Hofelin also is here, who runs the MLA and the Urban Design program. You'll see classrooms on every floor that are shared. On the lower level to the west, you'll see the new MFA in Design and Illustration program. So really, one of the things about our school is really, some have asked about the interdisciplinary collaborative effort. Some of our projects over the last 14 years might be considered experiments, thinking about how to leverage the relationship of art, architecture, design, and museum. The way that it works is it works both formally and informally, but often it works best informally when we bring people together and we have places to bump up against each other and see what each other are doing. One of the reasons we designed the space this way, to think about its transparency, is students wanted to be able to see and have this relationship without necessarily having to interfere with the work of their fellow students. It's also about health and well-being, this idea of having a beautiful light-filled space, bringing students together. There's a place of contemplation as well as a place of work. In a way, it's a living room for the idea that when our students work, as you know they often do, as you do in your studios 24/7, it's good to have a place to rest. But this is really just one building of a much larger idea. And I want to just tell you this briefly. When the idea of the building this building came about, this was a parking lot. And the thing that this project includes is the idea that in order to replace the parking, we had to think about where that was going to go. If you haven't, how many of you have been in the parking garage? It's a really great experience. What you see on the north and in Tisch Park is a green roof with 2 stories of parking. This really was an infrastructure project in many ways. It started with having to replace the parking that was on this part of campus. So it's unified by this central idea of Tisch Park, 2 stories of underground parking that was designed for the future. It's actually got 14-foot height ceilings, light-filled in the parking garage, and designed in order to actually be transformed into classroom spaces, because it has enough room and capacity to put in HVAC and other systems to have that be occupied space. So when we are post-cars, post-parking at least, it potentially can convert to classroom. Then the other idea really is to bring together the interdisciplinary relationships, not only within our school, but to the north you'll also see several buildings. They look old, but they're new, or they partially look old, but they're new, collegiate Gothic buildings that house the McKelvey College of Engineering. Engineering, of course, is a great partner with us, and on that side, you might even get a chance to see there's a great maker space, and we've coordinated both our facilities and our programs around some of these central ideas. The great thing for us is this has become our front door of campus building, so when you actually look at it from the common space below, and you look at the connections, we have the Welcome Center to the west, and it's also where we do admissions. We have a food pavilion to the north, and those two pavilions were also designed by Karen Timberlake out of Philadelphia, James Timberlake being the lead. And then we have the expansion to the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum that you'll get to see the wonderful exhibitions, including the Ai Weiwei exhibition. For just a second to tell you about that exhibition, because I know you'll get a chance to enjoy it. It's been a 3-year project. Many people ask me how we developed it. It includes a body of work of his that is from 20 years. So in a sense, there's a retrospective element about it, but the whole show was designed so that each piece was designed for the specific space because we were under construction. And Sabina Ekman, our curator of the exhibition and also the director of the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, worked closely with Ai Weiwei to bring the exhibition together. Given that Ai Weiwei, is also not only dealing with issues of the humanitarian crisis and refugee crisis, and dealing with a lot of the global issues that really speak also to the relationship of the role of art and design in addressing it's a good way for us to enter into thinking about not only his own practice, but how we in education really think about the mission of our schools. What are the roles of artists and architects and designers in the 21st century? How do we come together to solve larger systemic issues? The mission of our school and the power of bringing the interdisciplinarity together is really that artists, designers, architects have a whole range of knowledge, think on different scales. The connections that I think about for students are thinking that there's an opportunity for them to work small or work large. They can work really at any scale. If we create the space and the energy and the opportunity for enough flexibility within our schools to think about inclusion and diversity, and to think about how we educate and we create opportunities for everyone to be better critical thinkers, we at this time are in a position really as a field to really lead the way, because so many of the systemic issues are around the built environment and futuristically around technology, artificial intelligence, other infrastructure questions that we need to bring a sense of humanity and a sense of judgment to those things. So when I think about our school, I'll just add, finally, I think about the community and the international community being part of a global need to address these larger systemic issues. And we have a wonderful international population, not only here at the Sam Fox School, but also in all of your schools across the country, and how we diversify, how we address larger issues together, how we address some of the complex political terrain that is confronting education today, all really does come to play at all of our institutions. And what we're doing with many of our students is to think about how they will, in the future, be leaders of institutions that will educate the future artists, architects, designers, curators, and thinkers. So with that, I want to welcome you. I want to tell you that we also have 6 buildings as part of the Sam Fox School campus. You'll get a chance to enjoy what I often call is an ensemble of buildings that reflects all of those eras and architects that have designed spaces for us to work, play, and think in. Now, it's my great pleasure and and I'm glad to have the opportunity to also, in front of you, recognize my distinguished colleague, an architect, a leader in education, a true champion of our school, who has dedicated most of her professional academic life to building the College of Architecture and Urban Design, who herself is a great practicing architect and thinks deeply about pedagogical issues. Heather Woofter, the director of the College of Architecture and Urban Design.
It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I was really honored when Constance asked me to speak a few words about the school and to serve as her introduction to this symposium and conference. So good morning to everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the symposium, Decoys and Depictions, Images of the Digital. We're joined today by students, our faculty, and also our staff who are deeply invested in our education. And we especially want to welcome our visitors from schools across the country. And thank you for joining us here, and welcome from all of us here at Sam Fox School. So welcome. Thank you. One of the most impactful assets of the university is the St. Louis region. Carmen has spoken about our campus, but I'd like to go out a little broader. We are located at the epicenter of critical dialogues in social justice and ecology. St. Louis hails an inspiring architectural legacy, having been one of the most influential cities in the turn of the century, and it's also home to progressive mid-century modernist culture. Similar to many places, St. Louis experienced planning and zoning policies that worsened division and reduced open accessibility to municipal resources and created difficult moments of segregation. This contemporary city is in a state of reconciliation and advancement, with many large-scale and also local projects happening, infrastructural and also bottom-up initiatives. They're all underway, but there's still a lot of work to be done in the public realm. It is also the center of environmental issues. 2/3 of the continent's watershed passes by these doors, and the most impactful ecological strategies start right here in St. Louis with an understanding of complex natural systems that transition and transform while marking the effects of global warming. As the boundaries between nations dissolve and refortify, our cultures, economies, and ecosystems are more connected. We strive to create diversity here and to provide opportunities for our students to travel and understand broader contexts so that they can bring solutions back home. The architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture disciplines are made up of a collection of people, places, and distinct cultures, even within our own school, each with the ability to transpire unexpected realities through contact with the other, and Carmen spoke to this very eloquently. Not a singular activity, but rather a network where initiatives come together to represent the school's values. The strength of our programs lies in its multiplicity of different perspectives, excellence in the contemporary design discourse, and different forms of scholarly and creative research. And we care very much about the practice of architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, art practice. We enjoy enacting on our thoughts. This symposium occurs at a really perfect time, and we want to thank Constance for that. With the opening of Vale Hall and the exchanges between art and architecture made possible with art coming back on campus, we are now together for the first time. In addition, we launched this small program called Fox Fridays, and it's just an example of how we are opening up workshops on Fridays to all students across the school. And they're intended to be quick and fun into mediums and tools students wouldn't otherwise have access to, but they expose tools, techniques, processes that create a new kind of environment for our school and chance encounters. We expect the unexpected, virtualization, film, mathematics. It's not just about sharing, but also about projecting forward, where we'd like to go. So how does the symposium relate to all of this context? Rather than a simplified viewing of the digital image as a formative derivative, the conversation shifts to one of mediated realities and complex systems through the processing of modeled information. Technology eases communication between disciplines and models of working in these heightened transdisciplinary practices. As Constance Vale outlined in her opening paragraph for this symposium, digital images are vehicles for the production of form, the built components, and importantly, mechanisms through which artifacts and artists can form new audiences for our disciplines and contribute to social and political change. Patterns emerge, and tenets of architectural discourse, interior and exterior, ordering and array, composition and environment, they sit not separated from one another in theory and in practice, but rather they are connected. In Chandler Ahrens' new book, Instabilities and Potentialities, Notes on the Nature of Knowledge in Digital Architecture, he writes that information technologies create three main shifts in the way we approach architecture. Movement from an abstracted mode of codification to the formation of its image, the emergence of the informed object as a statistical model rather than a fixed entity, and the porosity of architectural discipline to other fields of knowledge. Thank you for that. The history of these conversations is not new to the school or to the faculty. In 2012, Catherine Dean curated and hosted the Symposium Digital Desires, Technology at the Intersection of Nature, Culture, and Meaning, in two groupings, one on ecological energies and the other on complexity. The conversations explored terrain that typically were excluded from the digital discourse, the role of nature, culture, and its meaning. In shaping the Sam Fox School, both Dean Carmen Colangelo and Dean Emeritus Bruce Lindsay drew from their research in digital tools. Bruce, with his 2001 book, Digital Gary, Material Resistance, Digital Construction, he's got a lot of titles, as is typical of Bruce, The Information Technology Revolution in Architecture. And as Carmen mentioned last night at the opening at Desley Gallery, his Printmakers Conference in 1996, entitled Remote Sensing. It's an exploration of sensory experiences, instead filtered through new modes of technology, and our understanding of technology and the body and our sensory interpretation of those in the creation of art and print, and the idea that print can be multiplied and that it can work through a different kind of medium and still be unique and have its own authorship. In addition, the Kemper Art Museum has long supported architectural exhibitions exploring the roles of representation. In 2014, with Drawing Ambiance, curated by Igor Marjanović, and also earlier that year, Sang Kwan and Angela Peng's exhibition on the thresholds of space making, Shinohara Kazuo and his legacy. Drawing Ambiance brought to our community the drawing collection of Alvin Boyarsky, with images produced during his tenure as chairman of the Architectural Association in London. Through the beauty of those hand-drawn images, many made to appear technological, architects and artists experimented with the definition and the future of architecture through those representations. Shinohara's future and his reach can be seen in the work of Ito, Nishizawa, Sana, Ishigami. His philosophy challenged the industrial metabolists, also explored at the Kemper Art Museum with Medwalik City exhibition. Shinohara entitled his philosophy Modern Next, as a counterpoint to postmodernism. Sang and Angela's written and curatorial work originated at the Kemper Art Museum and has since traveled to ETH in Zurich, and most recently, as of a few weeks ago, it was at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and I had the pleasure of a personal tour. It was fantastic. But it all originated here among a very rich dialogue between architecture, art, and the museum. So now to my second requested role. In addition to introducing some of the school's directions, I have also the bonus pleasure of introducing Constance Vale, curator and organizer of this event. So I'll say a few words about her. Assistant Professor Constance Vale moved to St. Louis from California, where she taught at SciArc and UCLA. Based in Los Angeles and New York, her research and design practice, Vale Collins Studio, and most recently, she directs the Factory of Smoke and Mirrors, a research practice in the territory of architecture, art, and theater. Constance has a background in fine arts with a BFA from Parsons School of Design and an MArch from Yale School of Architecture, where she received the Moulton Andrus Award of Excellence in Art and Architecture and 2 Feldman nominations. She taught design studios at SciArc and in the summer programs at UCLA and Parsons. Following graduation from Yale University, Constance began teaching at UCLA to join her Yale visiting faculty members Marcelo and Georgina of Patterns in LA. She collaborated with them on the book Mute Icons, a pressing dichotomy in contemporary architecture. At the same time, she worked with colleagues to develop innovative pedagogical strategies and engage contemporary architectural discourse dedicated to the culture of meaning in our discipline. Her passion for the practice of architecture is evident in her completion of her architectural licensing exam while she was in the throes of teaching, and also this exhibit happened just weeks ago. She maintains the critical value of practicing architecture In addition to working on speculative projects with Tyler Seth Collins, she collaborated with SciArc faculty Emmett Zeifman on a temporary theater for the industry's production of Hopscotch, a mobile opera for 24 cars. The Hopscotch opera production is an example of an ambitious project with technical prowess, detailed execution, and ambitious conceptual frameworks. It was actually during a phone call with David Rue of SciArc that he spoke of Constance to me when we were interviewing and her fit at Washington University in St. Louis. He believed that she would push the boundaries of our school in a great way. And he thought that she would influence students and faculty in the making of architecture, building, and creating, most importantly, bridges to art. She is an architect that builds and makes, and one who explores other disciplines as a mechanism for inspiration. Teaching in the core programs in undergraduate and graduate levels, Constance works with the faculty to reconsider the early design pedagogies, and that led to this symposium. In her words, forgetting is indispensable to learning. If you assume you already know something, you will be closed down to obtaining any new information about it. To be clear, this is not an endorsement of forgetting history, but one of forgetting preconception. Assumptions are the greatest danger to every participant in pedagogy. Well-worn vocabulary haunts the veteran. Perceived familiarity derails the novice, and habit starves institutions. This statement resonates here. This struggle of invention, balanced with a strong history of practice, exemplifies the aspirational education at Washington University in St. Louis. It is this deep passion for experimentation and exploration. Constance has a lovely way of connecting ideas, meandering from connection to connection, inclusive and generous in her definitions of architecture, with a precision in making things that signals her exactitude of thought, no matter where she might take us in her words. In addition, Constance is a talented designer, an educator with great capacity for student empathy, and a generous collaborator with her colleagues. Her sense of humor and energy is an important part of our community, and we are so lucky to have her here with us. This symposium and the many exhibitions that she pulled together are a demonstration of her openness to the hybridity of our community, and we welcome her. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Heather. I'm deeply moved by it and so proud to be here at Washington University in St. Louis. Good morning, I'm Constance Vale. You already heard all about me. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the School for Decoys and Depictions as well. And I hope you all had a chance to see the panelists' projects at the Desley Gallery. If you have not, you've got to stop by before November 16th. It's not to be missed. Their work is incredible. Over the past year, while I was working on this symposium, I've been thinking about the work being done at WashU in studios as well as in the practices of faculty, and what we do well, really well. Work that's concerned with the status of images and the implications of imaging on the discipline of architecture, and work that's invested in political, social, or environmental issues. In the discipline of architecture at large, at times, it seems that there is a desire to read these as two separate categories and see them at odds. However, the kind of work that understands these as integrally related, that I see happening here and in the work of our panelists and some of their institutions, is attentive to the omnipresence of the digital and its impact on the world. That work reveals some of architecture's greatest potential as a cultural practice. At the same time, I've been looking outside the school, in particular to our guests that will be presenting this weekend. I've been impacted by the work and writing of this group, along with discussions on reviews at conferences attended, like Cyrus Peñarroyo's Imaging Architecture panel at the ACSA Black Box, where many of our panelists were in attendance as well, and where Jonathan, Louie, and I spoke on Cyrus's panel. Or the Becoming Digital Conference, which McLain, Clutter, Ellie Abrams and Adam Puri co-organized. I was not present, but it's like an extremely influential event that was well documented enough, I think, to have an impact on the discipline, and in which many of our panelists, again, participated. Another conference that was organized that had many of our panelists is Mark Gage's Aesthetic Activism Conference, very different in tone and ambition, and different in the kind of work that it was trying to bracket. So the work and writing of this group have played a significant role in setting the agenda for this symposium. With that background in mind, I'd like to read the text that I used to frame the topic. In the contemporary world, nothing we produce as architects is what it seems at face value. Familiar outputs in the forms of drawings, models, and photographs, now produced through a spectrum of digital tools and techniques, masquerade as replicas of their predecessors when in fact they are entirely other. These products of electronic imaging have expanded the discourse concerning images and operate in the world as decoys and depictions. Decoys and Depictions, Images of the Digital, examines the role of digital images as grounds for theoretical development, vehicles for the production of form, physical components of building, and mechanisms through which architects and artists can form new audiences for our discipline and contribute to social and political change. Decoys are objects that share characteristics with images, and depictions are images that have the qualities of objects. They are not oppositions, but bookend the working space in which those architects and artists that are invested in constructing images operate. Generally thought of as representations, doubles, or fakes, they operate like staged scenes or props inserted into the existing surrounds. However, while the parameters of vision drive decoys and depictions, they are tuned to the visual world for only a fraction of their existence. Beneath the surface, they respond to a complicated matrix of applied pressures. Their unique visibility is only rendered when we see the invisible effects of the informational formats, material frames, fictional objectivity, and accumulations of data that underlie them. To see the images of the digital, we cannot simply look at digital images. We must look through them to the logic of their construction. Digital images are inherently multiple artifacts that are in perpetual translation, forming composites of ever-compounding information that distorts as it is shared, accumulated, stored, uploaded, downloaded, edited, and reformatted. Like theater, there is an inherent collectivity to these images. Multiple actors interface across collaborative platforms, and captured images anticipate constant possible audiences. These visually comprehensible piles of information speak to the complicated web of materials they chart, geopolitical boundaries they cross, and the energy they consume. Images are inherently political enterprises that can rewrite material informational and spatial boundaries. Architects have long had to contend with translating layers of information between image and object. Translations that are specific to the discipline of architecture require cyclical flattening and inflating, unfolding and reassembling, causing image and object to impinge on one another. Contemporary architectural problems concerning images are revealed in work that deals with this exchange in new ways, recasting images as objects and examining the imageable characteristics of objects. Decoys and Depictions, Images of the Digital aims to address critical questions about the capacity of images to transform architecture through a dualistic analysis of data and picture. The event includes 3 exhibitions, as I mentioned. One note about these 3 is that today's exhibition in the Kemper Museum is available at noon, so if you want to stop by at lunch, there's a limited capacity. And of course, you'll want to see the Ai Weiwei. We'll have the reception in the lobby of the Kemper at 4:30 p.m., so that's also a thing to put on your must-see list. A great debt of gratitude is owed to all of the event supporters and exhibition collaborators. Thank you to the many generous donors who support the Sam Fox School of Washington University at Washington University in St. Louis. Funding is provided by the Ralph J. Nagel Dean's Endowment, the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design, the College of Architecture, and the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. Additional support for the keynote lectures is provided by the AIA St. Louis Scholarship Trust and the Aben Family Visiting Critic Endowed Fund, established in honor of Professor Emeritus Leslie J. Lasky. Thanks especially to the Sam Fox School leadership, Director Heather Wifter, for her unwavering support of every aspect of the symposium and its related exhibitions. I'd also like to thank her for her incredible work during her time as director. I'm inspired by her intelligence, perseverance, kindness, and passion for architectural pedagogy. Dean Carmen Colangelo for his incredible support and for his dedication to increasing the relationship between architecture and art in the Sam Fox School. Monica Rivera, chair of the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design, who backed the student exhibition and provided extensive resources through the GSAUD. Igor Marjanović, chair of the College of Architecture, who supported the student exhibition as well, and for his mentorship and encouragement throughout. And to my colleagues and friends who were confidants and supporters, Sung-Ho Kim, Kelly Murphy, Jonathan Stittleman, and Allison Mendez, thank you all for your constant answering of questions and brilliant decision-making when I couldn't do it myself. Administrative support from the amazing Mandy Wortman, who has been incredible throughout this, Ellen Bailey, Audrey Treese, Melissa Messner, Julie Owens, Bobby Winters, Nicole Allen, Liam Auden, and the communications office, Catherine Welsh and Audrey Westcott, who did a wonderful job composing all of the materials for the event. For the exhibitions, again, the director of the Desley Gallery, Brandon Anschultz. I'm sorry, this is a very long list. He is an absolute pro, without which the exhibition would not have been possible, and as well to photographer Gina Graffos, who is documenting the exhibition and who produced some of the prints for the show. To the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum staff, especially Kim Broker and Laura Foudy, and to the faculty, staff, and students that supported the Steinberg Gallery student exhibition, including the design and fabrication team, Gregory Cudahy, who just joined us and was immediately ready and willing to build the amphitheater for models that you'll see in a few days if you haven't already. Mason Radford, who worked with me over the summer on the exhibition design, prototyping, and then built a huge collection of pedestals. Sam Ballhart, Rachel Reinhardt, the display and installation efforts of the dedicated Zhao Yang, Manny Kavarapatnam, Jonathan Stittleman, Bruna Sampaio, and Kelly Murphy, and the invaluable logistical support of Bryce Robinson and the incredibly patient and resourceful Leland Orvis. And I know there are so many others that helped on the student exhibition that I'd love to thank. I will keep those names. You can look at the back of the program and find some of them there. So thank you to all of you, and I'm looking forward to an incredible day with our participants, who I'd like to thank as well, that have come here to speak to us in the next 2 days. And it's now my honor to very briefly introduce Igor Marjanović, who will be moderating the Image Frames panel. Igor is the chair of undergraduate architecture, and Joanne Starloff-Kotzen, professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Igor, please, right ahead.
Good morning. It's my pleasure today to chair the first panel titled Image Frames. Either illuminated or projected on the screens, various images and raster graphics dominate our mediated present. These images are constructed in a stratum, from multi-layered LCD screens to printed images upon which ink is dropped or electrically charged powder is fused. As John May wrote in Everything is Already an Image, the digital models in which we work are real-time animations composed of infinite frames, wherein image and model are mapped onto one another and made visible through electronic signals. Masked just beyond the visible information is data, and that data is equally material in that it represents a form of processed energy. Images are also inseparable from their storage, as image data consumes power and takes up space. either real or imaginary. While architects have long worked through images, images of the digital are distinct from their predecessors. Titled Image Frames, this panel probes the slippery physicality of the digital media to uncover material properties hidden within its image frames. The panelists will investigate the gap between the layered materiality of raster display, physical output, and data. Strategies are borrowed from photography or stage set design, employing foam materials, the thinness of cladding, and materiality located in computer hardware. Indeed, the goal of our first panel today is to brush up against physical surfaces to incite the blushing of the very images themselves. Our panelists this morning include Jonathan Louie, who is Principal of Architecture Office and Assistant Professor of Architecture at Texas A&M University. Chandler Ahrens, Partner of Open Source Architecture together with Aaron Sprecher, and Associate Professor here at Washington University in St. Louis. Hans Tursack, Designer and Critic in Architecture at Rhode Island School of Design. Constance Vale, who needs no introduction at this point, AIA Architect, Director of the Factory of Smoke and Mirrors, and Assistant Professor here at WashU. Patricia Olynyk, Artist, Florence and Frank Bush Professor of Art, Chair of the MFA Program in Visual Art, and Director of the Creative Research Institute here at Washington University in St. Louis. McLain Clutter and Cyrus Peñarroyo, co-founders of Extents. McLain is Chair of Architecture and an Associate Professor at the University of Michigan, and Cyrus is an Assistant Professor of Architecture at the University of Michigan as well. Following their presentations, and they will come forward, present their talks one at a time, we'll be joined also by 3 interrogators who will provide additional questions to the panel and spark further discussion. Our guest from out of town is Todd Gannon, PhD and AIA, who is the Robert S. Livesey Professor and Head of the Architecture Section at The Ohio State University, and 2 of our very own colleagues here at WashU, Shantel Blakely, who is an architectural historian and assistant professor here at WashU, as well as Jack Risley, who is an artist and professor also at WashU College of Art. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Louie to the podium for the first presentation. Thank you.
Am I doing this correctly? Okay. Thank you to Heather Wooster and Dean Colangelo, and especially thank you to Brandon and Mandy for organizing our arrival, as well as congratulations to Constance for curating the symposium and exhibition. Everything has been exceptional. On behalf of Nicole McIntosh and myself, we're very honored to be here. Our practice and research is influenced by imagery that creates new contexts for architecture. And lately, we've been focusing on photographs and how they are translated into built form. Here are 2 examples of current research projects in our office. On the left is a traveling exhibition that's currently on show at the Kunsthaus Glores, and it looks into a building code that applies photography for the stylistic guidelines of an American village. Today, though, we'd like to talk about a collection of materials, some of which you can see on the other side. The project is called materials.jpg, and it makes use of image manipulation software, such as Photoshop, as a tool to manipulate the appearance of a physical entity. Currently, we're in the process of developing the materials into a cladding system. On the screen, you can see moving images that show variations on available color information of wood shingle texture maps that we've downloaded. To better position the work in the exhibit, that Constance brought up at the Desley Gallery. We'll give a little background on our interest in texture maps, and this will act as a roadmap into the project And then we'd like to show a house project that displays the potential for its application. So, well, Google and Google Search are portals to access information. Today, private and community-led databases are easily accessible portals for searching, uploading, and downloading imagery from around the world. Of interest to ourselves, as well as other architects, architectural enthusiasts, and students, is textures.com. It's an accessible archive of over 120,000 digital pictures, scanned surfaces, and objects that depict materials of all types. Through their web portal, users can download multi-pass collections comprised of one or more digital images that appear as similar to their physical counterpart. Texture maps are images in motion, to paraphrase Hito Stero. They are uploaded, downloaded, and shared. And with each action, the file gets reconfigured and reformatted. The result is the appearance of a digital photograph with material qualities that are akin to, but not the same as what we remember. One might say that textures.com is a storehouse for digital photographs that idealize a material type, but it does not fully archive the qualities of an actual material itself, or any one object that we know in the world. With this in mind, one might say that materials.jpg is an image research project that records the production of physical materials through the digital manipulation of texture maps in various formats. What we mean by that is that the active transmission and reconfiguration of image data result in something that are neither original building or even the first digital image. Over 50 years after its demolition and loss of material form, what remains of one example of this, the William G. Low House, are the measured drawings, photographs, and digital imagery that are officially collected and available through the United States Library of Congress. What's significant to us about this collection is that because the Low House is no longer here in its material form, the Historic American Building Survey is one of the last remaining windows to the building. Since its inception in 1974 as a means of mapping pixels or picture elements to a 3D surface, one might make the argument that texture maps in recent years have been increasingly embedded into virtual environments. They are data printed as scenes of another reality, such as in video games, and altogether built up as surfaces to approximate a future to come, as seen in developer renderings. With the increasing saturation of digital imagery through readily available hardware in our lives, our office is curious as to how texture maps can influence the appearance of the built environment. With this project, we're asking two questions. First, how do imaging techniques alter pixels to reconfigure the shape, structure, and appearance of architectural surfaces? And second, how do images estrange architectural elements and materials to affect our perception of its familiar identity? And certainly, one thing that lingers in our head is, at what point is it no longer recognizable as a material? And that's something we're hoping to work with other collaborators to figure out. To develop protocols for actualizing the picture elements of texture map images, we're experimenting with photorealistic rendering and fabrication procedures to translate pixels from virtual to physical form. Let's see. Yep, there we go. Shown here is a technique that maps images to surfaces and the resulting paper 3D prints at the top. To alter the physical form for the prints, we isolated and manipulated the RGB color data of specific mapping passes. And the 3D prints were a first try at effectively what we're showing in the gallery space at the exhibition. Of interest to us with this prototype is that the surface appearance starts to reveal the systems of logics that alter the initial downloaded brick or shingle image, as well as act as an identifiable link to a familiar thing, such as a material, object, or building in another place and time. Here is a close-up of one of the materials. We also made a video that tells a story of a certain peeping Tom sitting with foggy glasses in a parked car. And of course, the story speaks about this peeping Tom that while he's watching the scenes of a party in the adjacent rooms of a house, he witnesses a murder. So I'll just give a brief statement to wrap up this section of the presentation that just speaks about the work. When looking through the various frames, viewers see recognizable traces of a low-resolution texture map that depict a building material whose appearance displays the systems of logic that produce it, the raster images, the render passes, the CNC milling techniques, as well as the UV print. And altogether, they produce what is something that is not quite familiar to what we know in the world. The second project that we'd like to show uses photographs that influence the outward appearance of a house. It's called House and House, and it's a single-family home that deploys two images of its context, that of an existing log cabin and the surrounding forest that it sits within. The project was never built, but when we started it, it was located an hour south of Seattle, Washington. The site we're showing here the existing log cabin, and that was built in the 1950s, and it faces a small lake called Lake Walker. The client wanted a larger house similar to the suburban home she currently owns, but we believed that the value of the cabin was that it housed the minimal infrastructure and facilities one needs for living. To develop the design, we used the dimensions of the existing cabin as the basis for the new internal house within an outer wrapper. And here's a plan of the inner house with bathroom, kitchen, stair, and bedroom set within an outdoor or an outer open living space. And the bedroom above is under the pitched roof of the house. We saw the inner house as a permanent structure that looks like a sculpture and functions as a house. It's made out of thick concrete with a permanent footprint. And it's meant to be there and contains all the necessities for modest living. In a way, we thought of it as an homage to the existing cabin that we removed. The outer house looks like a house and acts only as an enclosure. It's inspired by the American tract homes, such as the ones photographed by Dan Graham, and it's made out of a typical wood frame construction with a crawl space below. In a way, you could say the outer house shelters the inner house, producing two levels of permanence, the concrete inner core and the shingle exterior. To develop the outer house, we are interested in blending the cabin's envelope in with the existing environment to make it disappear and become one with the context. We photographed the surrounding forest, then projected them atop the surfaces of the outer house. So you're looking at photographs of looking north, south, east, and west. And by linking the pixel of the images with typical shingles found in the area, the process defamiliarizes the expected house image. Here are some seasonal studies we did, and they're based off of photographs that are taken in different seasons in the site. But we ultimately decided to go with the green summer scheme. And what this resulted with is a camouflage graphic that merges the house with the surrounding environment. And to actualize the project, we developed a method of optimizing the application by averaging the colors of the photographs. So we ended up with something like over 200 different colors when we photographed the surrounding context, and that just wasn't possible. So to paint the exterior fiber cement shingles, we selected 18 colors that approximate the photographs of the surrounding landscape. And here's a close-up of the siding that appears to merge the building with the site. So similar to the digital photos that make up the texture maps of materials.jpg, the photographs of the forested site and cabin simultaneously construct the context and influence the appearance of the outer surface. In a world saturated by images, this work acts as object and image, and the characteristics reflect qualities of both. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. That was really interesting. And hopefully we can kind of start to figure out how we're going to tie all this together. I think it'll be a nice conversation at the end. So I'm Chandler Ahrens, a faculty here. I want to start the discussion off with kind of the expanded nature of drawing. So we know technology is really expanding the potential sources that we use to create images. Here, Casey Reese, using processing, or through kind of physicality, developing small little objects that create drawings. To Anish Kapoor, really creating kind of a physicality of making kind of drawing tools, or in case of Roxy Payne, developing various kind of technologies that start to kind of physicalize the development of drawing. So in general, drawings are really starting to expand, and what is the potential? It brings an interesting question for me, which is going to be something that kind of keeps going through this presentation. Here with Saul LeWitt, right? Is it a sculpture or is it a drawing? It's kind of interesting when we're not quite sure, and it can begin to oscillate between the two. Maybe even becoming more of a question the more kind of physical and object-like that it gets. So the nature of drawing and model in architecture, there's quite a precedent for this. I'm just going to show a few quick examples. Dilla Scofidio with the Slow House. And using various kind of technologies, starting to develop surface. And so the kind of understanding of the tool here, the chisel, as the kind of drawing implement on this massive spinning wheel, which is probably extremely dangerous, but it produces a really interesting result. Kind of back to more kind of traditional architects making models. Paper model. Paper typically a medium for drawing on. Here now is the medium for producing drawings. Probably one of the more kind of influential in terms of the work I'm going to present is some of these early drawdles, the drawing models. So it's kind of a hybrid between a drawing and a model. So it, again, kind of oscillates between a three-dimensional and the two-dimensional application of kind of lines built up on that. So thinking about that a little bit more contemporarily, David Freeland and Brendan Buck, they produced these series of computationally driven drawings, but then they're also 3D printing them out. So is this now still a drawing, or is this a model? I'm not trying to answer the question, by the way. I think it's more interesting as a question. People like Adam Marcus and Jason Johnson at the CCA starting to look at drawing on objects. Viola Ago, again, kind of developing these kind of models that are drawings at the same time. And so that begins to create the context for which I can discuss this work, which is in the exhibition. And so this is, again, it's a drawing model. It's both. It's of a project that was built, so it is actually representational, right? It's a diagram of the process of how that project was made. And so the upper part is really the diagram, the field, and a series of objects that kind of cut away. So those objects are now in the model. Those are now voids. And then the objects that are added are the gold pieces. And then down below is kind of the example of where they're shown. The interesting thing about making the drawing model is there's opportunities to show both the graphic quality and the spatial. And so here you have to kind of peek around the corner, the side corner of it, to find probably the most literal example of the actual built project, which is these kind of white and gold layers that are interspersed and stacked. So that's what you kind of find around the corner. And so my interest in kind of drawing computationally has been reflected in a class that I've run here a few times. I'll be running again in the spring. It's called Fabricated Drawings. And so this is a class where we take, on the left side of the image here, we see that there's these two images at the very bottom, the small squares. They're sampling those two images in Grasshopper. And then it's a process of selectively kind of taking points and generating kind of thick drawings from there. So again, it's a drawing, but it has thickness. And we're also using various digital fabrication equipment. So this one kind of said we're going to use the laser cutter. And so it had to be built up and kind of assembled. So it's both kind of being built up as a drawing, built up as a model. And so these come in various forms. But again, it's kind of image-based first. This one is actually, it's physical, it's real. It kind of looks like a rendering, the way it's photographed, but it is physical. Then we're also looking at drawings which are more horizontally stacked in a somewhat similar technique, though. On this drawing, the fabrication tool was the CNC mill. And so it had to be a subtractive process of developing a couple of surfaces, again, based off of two images. And there's a front and a back to that. Again, this is the kind of laser cutter drawing, sampling two images, kind of out of order, but back to the mill. And so again, it's coming from two drawings. There's a front and a back to these. And it begins to be about the combination. So all these drawings, you can see that it's a starting point of two drawings, and it's how do you selectively combine. And the last of the series of 5 drawings were much more kind of physical, where they're starting to develop objects in 3D printing. And so how do the idea of the combinatory start to be introduced into volumes? So a couple series of various student projects there. And this has kind of led to some of my current work. This is again, it's kind of an object, a drawing object. Here, kind of pulling away from the more kind of flat format to now a cubic format, but similar techniques of the combinatory. A couple different systems that are beginning to interact with each other. And then kind of taking that object, doing a series of drawings from that, and using a CNC, testing out various pens. And so part of this process is really just beginning to understand the kind of technical aspects of here, just kind of two-dimensional drawings. That's just about done. And here's some of the kind of physical drawings that were generated. So it started out with the object. Now we're kind of doing drawings of that object, using different kind of pens and pencils. Still, at this point, still kind of exploring what are some of the potentials of this. So looking at different pen types. Here, kind of a brush pen that you can start to alter the z-axis just slightly to affect line width, and even various watercolor pens. It seems like a lot of this is just determining what pens actually really do not want to be attached to a CNC. There's some that just really get destroyed. Similarly, the idea of kind of being image-based, because this last drawing was basically one of the scripts we had developed for the class. Here, just trying to run it through the CNC for the drawing. But similarly, kind of the last project I want to quickly show is, in a way, it's a drawing tool, where we're, again, kind of developing the tool. And it's image-based. So you can see there's a series of just raster-based images in the squares. And it's using daylight to try and draw with pixels of light. And so the script is sampling the image, is creating the target points, then a series of mirrors are trying to recreate that image on existing surface. In this case, the Fumihiko Maki building, Steinberg Auditorium. It's in the Edda's Cafe. And so there's a series of points. There's about 600 of these mirrors, each individually controlled by motors and controllers. And so depending on the image that you basically want to be your target, it will work with the sun angle to try and recreate that image. And so this is just generally what those mirrors are looking like. So each one you could think of as a pixel, independently controllable. And we can kind of see through this, it runs through the kind of resetting process before it sets its new position, since there's no sensors to know where it is until it gets reset. And it's sped up because it's pretty slow. And then you can begin to see some of the results. And so the idea is that each pixel we're able to basically draw on any existing surface. So while this is located in this building, it could potentially be in any building. And we're creating kind of an atmospheric condition through the idea of drawing. And it's flexible, it's movable, and could be adapted, could track the sun in any way. And so this is kind of the general effect, but it's similarly, in the sense that some of the earlier drawings were showing the student work, it's image-based first, and it's a way of kind of using an image as a starting point to then create your own drawings from that. So, thank you.
Excuse me for 1 second here. Set this up. All right. Okay, so I don't go over time. Thank you so much, Constance, for the invitation to come here today. I'd like to present my project in the exhibition within the context of a series of a sort of series of house designs that I've been developing, slowly compiling a series, and also within the context of a kind of contextual framework that I'm calling the neo-geometric. So I'll try to kind of quickly, abstractly sketch out that framework, touch on the two house designs, and then show the final project that's on display in the gallery. So this is the sort of like soft polemic that begins with the kind of end of a certain evolutionary aesthetic discourse. And I'll try to argue why aesthetic or digital images play a critical role in this kind of end game. We might call our current digitally inflected moment the limbo or purgatory after history. We rarely invent new visual concepts now, we mostly recycle. And as cultural theorist Mark Fisher says, the jumbling up of time and the montaging of earlier eras has ceased to be worthy of comment. It's now so prevalent, it's so omnipresent that we barely even notice it. Or more poignantly, in conditions of digital recall, loss is itself lost. We're constantly haunted by kind of high resolution representations of the past. So the idea is that the sheer scale of the digital archive causes an omnipresent retro condition that we can't escape. It's producing a kind of stasis in cultural production. We find ourselves collectively remixing the 20th century over and over again in what Fisher calls a kind of over-accommodation towards the past. We're digging through a kind of massive disciplinary scrap-in. This is Kevin Zucker's image of the Google SketchUp library when it first went online in the early 2000s. And so this is a bit gloomy as an intro, I know. But if we accept this loss and get over these kind of nihilistic endgame arguments or crisis arguments, saying that we might not have avant-garde rupture anymore, but we can say that some historical composites are more relevant than others. Pluralism doesn't have to be entirely toothless. And I would say that we're at our best when we're working at, a more modest argument than avant-garde rupture would be, when we're in a space between ironic citations of the past and kind of, or sort of naive rehearsals and ironic citations. So here are a few strategies on the menu to keep moving and maybe find some running room. We can look for incomplete and unfinished projects from the past. And maybe the art of navigating the digital archive is now about particular configurations of fragments of historical scraps, basically how we go about sampling. So in my own work, I've been looking recently at neo-geometric art, also called simulationism or neo-conceptualism as a model of historical sampling. This was a movement born in the East Village art scene in the 1980s. It's been somewhat over-identified with Baudrillard's notion of the hyperreal, but it is essentially a hyper-real or a super-accelerated blend of minimalist sculpture and the pop art that came just before it. It's a kind of like over-caffeinated enthusiasm for the recent past, for recently dead movements. And there's an added element of sci-fi futurism in the work too, which you could argue is already late in earlier brands of minimalism proper, like Tony Smith's or Robert Smithson's. So what I like about Neo Geo as a diagram or as a historical composite or pastiche is that the movement reconciles interests in primitive geometries, an interest of mine, painterly or graphic issues, and a kind of object fetish. It reanimates a serious interest in late modernist geometric art, but kind of added with that is pop consumer references. And this is kind of a rough speculative component logic of what a Neo Geo architecture might look like, the kind of historical and thematic strata, what one might borrow from to produce it. An interest in rigorous geometric structures, in the mode of the New York Five, for example, pop graphics and color research, and even the aesthetics of a kind of sci-fi eco-futurism. And I think you see this most clearly in the proto-architectural Neo-Geo sculptures of someone like Ashley Bickerton. Works like his Anthropospheres of the late 1980s carefully reconcile the kind of right historical ingredients for me, which are minimalist geometries, this fetish for the object, commercial pop graphics, component systems, and then again, projections of ecological peril. So the pop element, which is critical to Neo Geo, comes from the too bright day glow colors and product design elements that the work celebrates. Someone like Haim Steinbeck literally splices commercial products into his pieces. And Bickerton will kind of cover his boxes with logos like a NASCAR almost. And the ecofuturism bent can be seen in Bickerton's work that models escape pods and kind of survival chambers. Anthroposphere 1 reminds me of the kinds of arguments that new materialist narrators like Jane Bennett make. Bennett being someone who tries to give political agency to things like bottle caps, dead rats, electrical grids, all in the same sentence. And she reopens pre-modern conversations around object animism. So similarly, Steinbeck's work attracts people like Timothy Morton, people at the kind of cross-section of object-oriented ontology and ecological theory. So anyway, that's the conceptual setup. Here's the work and how I'm understanding how I'm working on these two houses, maybe a kind of neo-geometric or simulationist or neo-conceptual architecture. So using the Neo Geo art formula, I try to navigate the archive looking for things like, again, hard-edged geometric art, minimalism and high modernism, which is work couched between a discourse on abstract painting and simple geometric sculpture, the commodity fetishes of pop art and architecture, a love of synthetic materials and objects, the factory-made, assembly logics, graphics and decals, and potentially a theoretical discourse that asks us to elevate the ontological status of objects. New materialism, not triple O, just to be clear. So both projects address abstract painterly or graphic problems on their elevations. In the Neo Geo equation, these kinds of surface interests come from two moments, again, pop and minimalism, one more sincere, one more ironic. So in Haim Steinbeck's work, it looks almost like a Donald Judd sculpture or an Anne Truitt sculpture by way of kind of like Walmart kitsch. And Peter Halley is kind of like an arcade refix of someone like Frank Stella who came before him. But in the case of both of my houses, I was imagining interior and exterior elevations as something between painterly abstractions and pop graphics, like an architectural scale minimalist object, but like coated with decals. And in both houses, each major elevation is divided into 4 and 16 squares. Within the grid system, you see variations on a geometric theme. Each face of the cube house is another iteration within a system, a loose system, much like the Judd print series that I showed earlier. So the elevation plays the role of a frame, or what I'll argue it as a kind of irregular canvas support, and I'll explain that in a second. And the plans are played between 9 and 16 squares, not as relevant as the elevations. So the compositional grid games on the elevations are registered by gaps between the cladding. There's a visual conversation between the elevation panels and the kind of lines that they create, the windows, the graphic shapes of the smaller green patches, and the main color field of the background, which I see as the kind of elevation profile as it's a silhouette against the sky and the city. And I'd like to think that there's an analogy between the relationship between line, color, and the massing figure, the kind of profile that I was talking about of the elevation, and something like shaped canvas painting. And so in an image like this, 2 references come to mind. The first reference is the minimalist painter Robert Mangold. Mangold makes an argument for a kind of part to fragmented whole, where 2D shape, physical support, and line work act reciprocally. The other reference is Ted Stam. He's also a shaped canvas painter. And like in the Mangold zone painting that I just saw, you can see the graphic figures, in this case, that kind of wrap the irregular supports, or you can think of the irregular supports as kind of cropping the Malevich crosses. More of a masking technique. But sometimes the graphic slips over the panel support geometry as well. So perceptually, the graphic is supposed to be as primary as the material profile of the panel and the white field. Again, as you're walking around the house, you're testing each composition against your memory of the others, the ones that you've previously just seen. And in this, it's more about Gestalt experimentation, the kind of high modernist side of graphics, than it is about semiotic supergraphics. Each elevation is supposed to work like a Ted Stam painting or a Robert Mangold shaped canvas painting. And so clearly a sub-theme of both houses is that graphics are on par with geometric, material, and structural systems. They're primary elements in our contemporary collective formal imaginary, I'd argue right now. Think of practices like Zago architects or Denari. And I want to create a similar argument for color as material. The second house I want to show is more explicitly tied to someone like Ashley Bickerton and Haim Steinbeck in the Neo Geo set. In the narrative that I built around it, it's less a house than a kind of display case or a vitrine for geometric objects, maybe like a destination gallery. And again, the elevation as graphic datum was a formal driver for the project, which is historically a familiar trope in post-war formalism. You can think of movements like the Texas Rangers or the early New York Five. But unlike those movements, I'm less interested in the kind of cubist picture frame, which is like a stacked deck of vertical cards, especially in the famous Bernard Hoseley diagram of the deconstructed cubist painting, and more like something that you would see in Anne Truitt's sculpture, where color is very much on the surface of the object. You walk around it, it's on the surface of the form, you study each face of a solid mass in the round in time. They're objects wrapped in paintings. And again, on the theme of kind of like resuscitating unfinished projects in the digital archive, for me, the unfinished component of that line of formalism is Robert Slutsky's research project entitled Cube Chrome, Slutsky being the silent painterly voice of the New York Five. In an essay with Joe Nachman, Slutsky argues for a process of generating form where color, geometry, and proportional systems are assigned variables. Color isn't decorative or patina, it's structural. And he assigns numerical values to those different categories working through Albert Munsell's color wheel, and those values directly affect movements on the actual massing geometry of the building that he's working on. So in the process of form generation, shifts in the placement of color directly correspond to geometric movements, and I tried to riff off of this idea, though not as rigorously. And there's an effort to kind of engineer the viewer's experience as the elevation unfolds in the round. So color's more centrifugally applied to the exterior of the eroded solid cube. It's coming to the outside. The color wants to kind of come off the object into our space, more like a truet, or again, the shaped canvas paintings that I was referencing, which operate more like walls than picture windows, illusionistic picture windows. And again, in both houses, there's a kind of kit of parts or component logic, thinking through industrial design sensibilities or British high-tech, celebrating the assembly, maybe even making the assembly into a kind of image. Parts of the project showcase objects and plants, like an early Kuhn's vitrine or the Bickerton boxes, and I'll flip through these quickly. For the installation of this project, I fabricated a suite of light boxes for the renderings, starting to work with vinyl graphics, and the light box was a kind of analog stand-in for the digital screen. I also notationally referenced the detailing logic of the house and the furniture scale vitrines, terrariums, or the kinds of casings that would have to be designed for the mechanical equipment on the roof. This is an array of fabricated panel studies. You can see the iterative graphic permutation games, variations on a theme again. Variations on a theme again. But also this idea that the graphic has to be rendered in layers of materials. What I want are graphic composition games without the rhetoric of modernist transparency. I'm interested in a kind of like blunt opacity, working within the thick 2D of a relief, excuse me. So in this, the painter Amy Noble, another shaped canvas painter, was a critical model for me. Again, looking at Bickerton, Judd, Peter Halley, as working in the liminal space between painting and a kind of hybrid frontal sculpture or low relief, and gesturing towards the assembly logic of the houses at large. Okay, the final house that I'll show very quickly is the third in the ongoing series. Here there's a kind of concerted move away from the opaque eroded cube games. I was thinking along the lines of the more diaphanous examples from Hayduck's Seven Houses Texas series. And also there's a more explicit reference to British high-tech, which I've been kind of peripherally referencing. In this case, mainly the Hopkins residence, personal residence in Hampstead. Or more banal things like just day-to-day infrastructure, scenic overlook pavilions, or cell phone towers. But I continued to imagine the program as a theater of things with so many kind of vivariums and object vitrines, again in the mode of Steinbeck's shelves or Bickerton's survival capsules. And so to wrap up and quickly conclude and kind of finish the polemic that I set up, I wanted to reiterate that I'm less interested in the novelty of digital images per se than I am in the digital archive and how we reanimate or make undead what we sample. And I think we have to accept Mark Fisher's diagnosis of this kind of all-pervasive state of dyschronia. That's just a given for me. The fact that history is leaking into every aesthetic act, and that leakage doesn't even feel particularly uncanny anymore. It's not like Jameson's kind of postmodern pastiche where there's friction between the samples. We're more and more frequently encountering much smoother assemblies of citations. But what Neo Geo art models for me, and why I see it as generative, is this idea that of an immersive acceleration of previous movements. So instead of static sign play or postmodern ironic citation games, artists like Peter Halley suggest that living at the end of the history calls for an almost euphoric over-celebration, over-subscription to previous aesthetic strategies. The neo-geometric really embraces and celebrates endgame stasis. It relishes in the permutation and precision recombination of past historical episodes. So, thank you.
So I am pleased to be presenting with all of you, although in a state of semi-distraction, so bear with me as I'm busy working on all of the preparations for this. The contemporary world is super saturated with images that are generated, circulated, consumed at incredible rates, as much of the buildup has described. This atmosphere, an apparent fog or dust, is actually quite material, and there are layered surfaces and puffs of energy in that mix. Architects have long had to deal with translational instability that causes image and object to have an effect on one another, to have to think across those lines. With that in mind, architecture is particularly well suited to tackle questions surrounding images, and images have a lot to offer architecture. Constantly in flux and awaiting possible audiences, and wrapped around material, images bring architecture closer to theater. I'd like to start with a brief definition of images. To interrogate the capacity of images, we must understand that they're presented in a stratum from the 6-layered LCD screen, so a thick flat, to variable paper thicknesses onto which ink is dropped or electrically charged powder is fused. Images cannot be viewed without the depth constructions that render them visible. As John May puts forward in Everything is Already an Image, images are data, and that data exceeds their pictorial aspect and swallows everything in the magnitude of its wake. Data is always already plural and refers to a set of related figures that undergo multiple layers of translation when accessed, from matrices of letters to numbers to zeros and ones to the electronic signals of transistors to picture elements or pixels. These alter chrominance and luminance when viewed on a screen, exploiting human optical and cognitive capacities to interpret visual information at a distance. Images repeatedly shift their identity in order to present to momentary humanoid or mechanical audiences. These data sets are material in that they are processed energy. Images are inseparable from the layered processes at play in their storage. They consume power, occupy volumes, fill server rooms, and subsume the singularity of any datum. So with all this said, the term remains muddy. Unless fitted with a prefix, the word image slips between categories and by definition oscillates between visual, cognitive, and technical realms. To the visual, images are likenesses from the Greek icon or icon. They are a sign or representation. The cognitive use is bound to imagination, wherein ideas are described as mental images. As for the technical, variable apparatuses record and filter the information of images, from the camera's recording of light to the medical imaging devices' scanning of objects with electromagnetic beams to the electronic signals of the computer as conveyed on a screen. None of these categories remain entirely discrete. Images straddle all three in varying degrees. An examination of images benefits from a widened scope of interrogation that acknowledges the inherent impurity of the word's denotation. Images are complicated by their translation and carry impressions of each form that they take. So rather than entirely sequester digital imaging, this study considers the potentials of contaminating discrete worlds of multiple image types, allowing for their potential to be opened up across the visual, cognitive, and technical registers. This investigation intends to remain precise in terms, combining image types not to dilute them, but to look for productive hybrids. As such, we can examine how images confer the aesthetic effects of their material data onto the world of things under their spell. Okay, so I often look to objects that become or attempt to become images and vice versa, and these capitalize on our, this is a lot of symposium talk, capitalize on our expectations of the world's continuity and act as scenes or props. And in fact, I work oftentimes in the territory of theater. So if we take just a moment to step into a very, very brief study that I did for the Institute of Patent Infringement open call for patent violation, led by Matthew Stewart and Jane Chu. They had requested that the participants look into the possibilities of taking Amazon patents and running them into new sort of like repatched versions. And so in my analysis, I decided to very quickly throw them into a city that requires no underlying connectivity, because in fact these things are infrastructured through sort of external network and operating autonomously. So the directing of these implements is at a remove. I'm now working on a project that's in its very early stages in the School of Engineering here with Eugene Vorshevsky. And the two images shown here are various machine vision possibilities that are used in autonomous vehicles, from point cloud data based on photograph radar and related GPS maps and sensors, and then a LiDAR point cloud, which is the kind of technology that's being explored in his work. Now, to jump to the side, there are some things that I'm thinking about as I'm starting to undertake this model, things that are drawn from these words that are being deployed in this symposium. So the most familiar use of the word decoy, of course, is the decoy duck, which has developed to have a lure to the creature that is seeing it at a distance, and to convince, not through camouflage, but rather through its extreme visibility and reception as a duck. So these developed first as carved wooden birds and then grew in scope to become elaborate scenes in sink boxes that actually start to meld into the surface of the water. There, of course, are developments from there into military applications with decoys that are inflatable tanks, so thought of in terms of their ability to be planted and to distract from enemy forces that would think that they're in fact real when they're inflated quite quickly. The controlling parameters include size and weight for transportation, the time required for their inflation, and the granularity of painted detail. They're designed to require as little mounting time as possible, and were composed of an inflatable rubber frame draped in a rubberized canvas screen. Unconvincing material orders could be identified up close, but were masked at a distance. I know this is my favorite part. Even set amidst tire tracks to create the illusion of their weight. The distant frame of aerial reconnaissance photography controls the necessary elaborations of the object's screen. Norman Bell Getty's war models are serving also as something of a device through which I'm thinking about this project, and you'll see in a minute why. So Norman Bell Getty's war maneuver models, commissioned by Life magazine, were large enough to be considered a constructed ground. Surrounded by elements of sound stages, these terrain models were perpetual stop-motion machines layered with malleable materials from table salt waves to cotton explosions. Their image status is particularly fraught by layered translations and an unstable relationship to time. Cinematic sets of photos captured past scenes and speculated on future tactics without distinction so as to dissolve any claims the model might lay to objective factuality. And then last in this set of generative information is Colonel John F. Ulmer's camouflage, developed with Hollywood filmmakers during World War II, that concealed U.S. military bases and aircraft plants behind a giant painted canvas screen. These horizontal facades depicted uncanny suburban landscapes replete with hollow wooden houses, spun glass landscaping, plywood cars, and lumpy burlap trees, all strangely proportioned in the vertical dimension. Calibrated to the capacity of the cameras used in military reconnaissance, objects had just enough detail and were just tall enough to produce convincing shadows for the picture's frame at an extreme remove. So I am undertaking a series of material, or continuing to undertake a series of material studies that had a bearing on the second project that I'll show, thinking about how to deal with the textural qualities that are evident in LiDAR, with LiDAR, and the kind of surfaces that can be read and produce tangency with photographic information. So seeing a way to realize these things that could start to disrupt or in some cases align to the way that LiDAR would work in a real-world, full-scale environment. The environment in which the project with the School of Engineering here at WashU will be undertaken is actually a scale model. So the car is much, much smaller, but is still an autonomous vehicle. And in this scenario, starting to look at what material would be read through photogrammetry, thinking about how to start to produce things that might fluster the way that those readings take place. And then the primary request is that this model be reconfigurable. So starting from a place that would look at all of the possible, and all is a tough thing to imagine, so this is a preliminary step to start to collect various urban conditions and think about what kind of catalog would be necessary, and perhaps a little bit tangent to Collage City, taking some of those and beginning to make an inclusive environment that would repopulate with all of those different possibilities. So here are just a sampling of those. In my other project that takes some of the same texture mapping information, looking at things like the other and earlier use of the word decoy, the decoy pipe, which is possibly less well known, but again, the source of the term. These consisted of labyrinthine constructed waterways surrounded by hoop frames, clad with a net and filled with live captives. Offset wooden walls obscured hunters looming beyond, and critical to the structure is the seamless continuity of the inner world to the world outside the envelope. This precipitated the offsetting of material layers just beyond the duck's perception. And then Daguerre's diorama, which displayed a pair of large paintings at the end of a 40-foot long hall. Mechanical shutters directed light from concealed windows to the front or back of paintings on linen screens. The screens were painted on their front with standard illusionistic techniques intended to reflect light, but the back side was rendered with varying thicknesses of paint to refract and transmit light. It was not the implied picture that created the effects of the diorama, but the dimensional data of its material screen as framed by its apparatus interior. So this stage set, made for Insight Theater Company's production of Silent Sky, attempts to engage images through building and represents design research into the layered material information of images. Silent Sky tells the story of Henrietta Leavitt, a human computer at the Harvard College Observatory tasked with examining photographic plates in order to measure and catalog the brightness of stars. Through her work with these photographs, she revealed the relationship between the luminosity and period of stars, establishing the first standard candle, and thus contributing to Hubble's revelations that extended the distance of the universe far beyond our own galaxy. That's just to give a little context on the... Oh, there we go. Backstage, Silent Sky, oh right, the design for the set and studies done in relation to it are characterized by strange speciations of image-mapped objects constructed as a series of decoys, a digital model at 1:8 scale, a 1:1 scale model, and a projection mapping model. All elements are built with partial data that when combined produce a complete artifact. In the digital model, materials and features are applied through texture mapping, relating pixels to UV axes of surfaces, and different components of the model are rendered as stills or animated and composited with the 1:8 scale model. The 1:8 scale model is wrapped in material and printed images, then photographed in a series of stop-motion frames. It is mapped back onto portions of the digital model or inserted into the animation and projected onto the 1:1 scale model. The 1-to-1 scale model inscribes an open room offset from the surrounding black box theater, and the walls are doubled interior that are clad in a fabric screen and receive a projected animation. There we go. The moving image is tied into the coordinate location and orientation of the projector in the room through projection mapping. In this procedure, corners and edges are specified in order to distort the Cartesian grid that underlies the image onto the oblique surfaces of the 1-to-1 model. The composite subtly reveals the logic with which it has interfaced and the labor of its construction through irregularities and misregistered layers. Parts of the projection are mapped onto three-dimensional elements, while others fall flat onto the backdrop. After they're seen, built elements remain on stage with their image removed, leaving only ghostly shadows. Backlighting behind the screen dissolves the image into colored light and allows the 1-to-1 model to project its framed construction in silhouette. Objects depicted in the scene are rendered or built as worm's eye obliques, and create affinities between the pictorial and built information. The corners and screens do not meet and instead exist in an unfolded state that disrupts the continuity of the projected image. An automated track of atmospheric changes coincides with material shifts in the prop furniture to suffuse the image with architecture. Projected image and video layers are scheduled and linked with audio and lighting, indelibly tying data to the material of the room. So this project is an attempt to examine the possibility of an architecture of layered images, compositing and compressing their material into an accumulative object. Each translation acts as polishing grit that erases some portion of the others while leaving the sticky residue of its own properties. All are conceived as projected doubles that lack an original and deny a linear reading of the image's history or objective source. And each element contributes only a partial picture of a series of objects and images that compose a reel. And with that said, I am going to wrap and welcome Patricia Olynyk.
Am I on full screen now? Not yet. Good. Constance, thank you. What a distinct pleasure to be invited to be part of this terrific symposium, and thank you, Heather Woofter and Carmen Colangelo and everybody else who's worked so diligently to make us all come together today. So Constance invited me to discuss the work that I have a documentation for in the Desley exhibition, a piece called Dark Skies, which is currently on exhibition at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So I couldn't bring the piece here. Apologies for that, but you can see documentation of it at the Desley Gallery. I think it's a great video made by Adam Hogan, one of our wonderful distinguished alums. So since the 1960s, the ethos of unity, collaboration, and interdisciplinary research has emerged in many research institutions, including Washington University, but also including MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies, founded by Georgi Kepesh. In addition, around the same time frame, the popularization of complexity theory, cybernetics, and theories of coexistence occurred and inspired artists to engage technologies and to design objects and environments that heighten the viewer's awareness of the worlds that surround them. Science and technology have increasingly informed the realms of art and design and provided the means to enhance our understanding of the perceptual and behavioral responses to the world. And this is where my own work resides. So my work, including the work in this exhibition at Desley Gallery, Dark Skies, also concerns affective encounters with scale. These are encounters that make us aware of our bodies in relationship to other entities and to our environment. And they occur broadly throughout human experience. They occur when we view miniature particles through the lens of a digital microscope, for example. They also occur when we wander through monumental physical environments. Certainly geological, dynamical, and thermal scales provide models for understanding divisions of time, mass production, and industrialization. Microfinancing provides models for analyzing scales of capital. So with Dark Skies, I probe affective scale and examine how both the physiological and aesthetic dimensions of affect play out through a variety of spatial, temporal, and phenomenological encounters. So Dark Skies is a multimedia, multisensory collaboration with the architectural firm Axiomi and Sung Ho Kim, and with sound designer and alum of the MFA in Visual Art program, Christopher Ottinger. The work is motivated by the omnipresence of light pollution, defined by the International Dark Sky Association, or IDA, as an excessive amount of obtrusive artificial light which affects sleeping and feeding patterns, brainwave activity, and cell reproduction, overall our circadian rhythms. The work takes as its title an astronomical reference, referring to remote places free of hazy city light that allow for an extended view into deep space and time as a unique perceptual and psychological experience, and physiological experience. So in here you can see a lot of light pollution. There we are, sort of hovering over Central Park in New York City. So in 1994, a 6.7 magnitude earthquake crashed the power grid in Los Angeles. The sky was flush with cosmic bodies that had been invisible up until that point. So what was that large silvery cloud that trailed over the city? Well, it looked so sinister that you couldn't even get through on 911. Everybody called emergency services because something was going on in the sky. They had not seen this night sky before. So this piece began by my thinking about the negative impacts of light pollution and our inability to observe the world around us, and what effect this had on human consciousness. Aside from the loss of stars from view, light pollution has more quantifiably dangerous effects. Studies over the last decade suggest that the modern practice of keeping our bodies exposed to artificial light at night increases cancer risk. This has been quantified by the National Library of Medicine, and the International Agency for Cancer Research declared shift work a probable human carcinogen. And now a large study of 164 countries adds another piece of evidence implicating light pollution. So we know that our little nocturnal friends really suffer with excessive light. You know, all you have to do is put a flashlight on a Florida beach and see what happens to confuse the turtles that are supposed to be going into the ocean here. So Dark Skies coalesces modes of sensing on and around a large-scale projection, right? An image projected onto a solid surface, an object surface. And this is a large-scale projection while modeled after the prickly surface of a wild mouse taste bud. So that's what you're looking at now. Given the right angle and proximity, that same wall oscillates in scale between the microscopic and the gargantuan. This is the affect of producing a wall based on this form. So it seems to vacillate between the lingual papillae, that's basically taste bud, and a kind of mountainous terrain, which I'll show you in a moment. Here's an image made up of infinite frames or SEM scans of the wild mouse taste bud, and this is Sung Ho Kim's digital representation of that taste bud. And what we're really trying to do is transfer that form into a digital projection surface. And these are the different tests that we did. We were trying to figure out how deep the surface of the projection wall could be. And there's a digital mock-up of the space. And here we're trying to determine, based on the relief and the projectors, what the human shadow, how the human shadow would be implicated in the work. And here we go, beautiful large-scale CNC routed, digitally routed tile. There's me kind of playing it like a piano because I'm so delighted. This is here in our own School of Architecture. So, and here's a a detail of that. So this is the interpretation of the wild mouse taste bud. The wild mouse is a creature that comes out at night. It comes out when the sun starts going down, the wild mouse comes out. And this is the digital wall with the projection system in place. So 2 discrete videos projected at oblique angles on either side of the wall create a kind of pulsating lenticular effect that is periodically interrupted by the viewer's own shadow. Dark Skies provokes an affective alignment of the visual and acoustic rhythms that are found in the piece. It immerses the viewer in a kind of complex sensorial experience. So these vespertine skies slowly fade to black, tracking the passage of time, and the cosmos gradually appear in the form of small particles and milky trails that stream vertically across the surface. And there are numerous speculations on affective behavior in contemporary art, particularly over the past decade and a half. One of the other presenters already mentioned Anish Kapoor. Artists also such as Louise Bourgeois and Charles and Ray Ames, of course, with Power of 10, have all produced work that complicates both the viewer's understanding of scale in the object environment, but also the relative scale of the viewer in relation to that environment. In the case of large-scale projections and other immersive environments, the works can provide a kind of dramatic reframing of the perception of scale, disrupting the viewer's sense of spatiality and temporality. Spatial conditions are further complicated by the notion that within such environments, particularly embodied environments, the viewer occupies the same spatial realm as the artwork or viewing experience, yet at the same time exists in a uniquely spatial matter. And this is what continental philosopher Martin Heidegger would proclaim as the viewer not simply existing in space, but rather existing spatially. So Sung-Ho Kim states that while producing the data sets for the digitally routed surfaces, he imagined matter made of tiny particles in constant motion from which the scales of the universe would appear to emerge. Christopher Oettinger, sound designer for the work, states that the sound elements in Dark Skies serve 2 functions. The first sonically articulates the ambiguous space between micro and macro worlds, echoing those depicted in the video, and the second adds an interactive and immersive quality to the work. So when you're standing before this wall with the projections at 2 raking angles, there are also 2 speakers on either side. So you're immersed in this environment that has a kind of spatialized sound quality. Field recordings, which I captured in the Rocky Mountains during the twilight hours, reveal small sounds, birds and insects, that Oettinger enlarged. Large sounds, creatures that inhabit the night sky, were shrunk down. These were subsequently edited, sped up, of course, all digitally, slowed down and filtered to locate hidden tones, noises, and frequencies located within the source audio to create 2 uniquely layered audio tracks. One emphasizes lower frequencies, deep rumbling sounds intended to shrink the listener down to the level of the microscope. The other presents the listener with an expansive sonic landscape that morphs from flourishes of birds and industrial machinery to spooky moans that emerge from the distance. Likewise, with the 2-channel videos, the 2 digitally produced soundtracks are projected directionally into the exhibition space, allowing the viewer essentially to move between micro and macro worlds. So in summary, Dark Skies prompts a heightened awareness of the interrelationships between biological systems, affective behavior, and embodiment. Some of the emergent properties related to interrelated biological systems and physiological response are expressed by art historian Christina Albu. Albu states, Dark Skies has the potential to trigger affective alliances between the participants and the projections of a habitat quivering with life. It plays on the precariousness of human presence within the world and its contingence upon biological systems that are not always visible. Borrowing strategies from theater design, whereby one's shadow interrupts a single projection in which the shadow in turn is filled with the other projection, participants' shadows become part of a flux of images playing across the wall of undulating shapes. This interaction epitomizes the physical entanglement into ecosystems that are modeled by interconnectedness that defy boundaries between species. The shadows are always in motion, always contingent upon participants' bodies, but also upon the variability of the environment around them. For example, the intensity of the light, the presence of others interfacing with the projections, so on and so forth. They are individual, but they also speak to a degree of anonymity and cohabitation with other beings, whose shadows may merge with ours to the point of being indistinguishable or not easily interpretable. They draw attention to the contagion that may occur between them from the perspective of the viral spread of moods, bacteria, and ideas. Ultimately, I, Christina Albu, believe Dark Skies underscores the imbrication of personal bodily presence in systems that cannot be controlled at an individual level and may be too unpredictable and complex to be controlled by humans. So I'll just show you a little bit of the video. Let's see if I can get it to go. There we go. Is on my website, and thank you very much.
All right. Thanks to Constance for the invitation and for everyone here at WashU for hosting us today. It's already been a great event, and we're looking forward to the next couple of days. We are Cyrus, Peñarroyo, and McLain Clutter, partners in Extents. And this morning we're going to talk about a few projects that each, in different ways, are experimenting with the materiality of images and our increasingly digital environments. And the first project we'll talk about is the one partially exhibited in the gallery, Image Matters. Images, as we know by now, are everywhere in contemporary culture. We constantly stare at screens, composing images from thousands of illuminated pixels. Images circulate as data through fiber optic cable. Terabytes of images are stored in silicon in our devices and servers. We hold mental images in our brains, and our world is still, and increasingly, packed with images in the form of a range of photographic formats. There's a rich basis of thought within disciplines ranging from architecture to media studies that theorize images as representations of past events or projections of future visions. But the present ubiquity of images, the sheer amount of physical and virtual space they occupy in our world, demands that they now be understood as objects in their own right. Images constitute an increasing proportion of the stuff of everyday reality, and yet it seems that the matter of images remains underexplored. So this project has investigated the materiality of images. This slide probably isn't necessary for this audience and this conference, but our work engages a wide spectrum of theorists, designers, and practitioners from the arts, humanities, and sciences who have recently turned critical attention to the vast proliferation of images within contemporary culture. And here we're talking about a broad bibliographic range, from media theorists like Wilhelm Flusser and Friedrich Kittler, to those gathered under the emergent subdiscipline of media archaeology, to architectural theorists like Mark Linder, to contemporary designers and architects working on image, including many of us in the room now.
So the project we're going to talk about first recovers the materially rich early photographic process of the tintype or the ferrotype. A lot of you probably know what a tintype is, but for those of you that don't, it's an early photographic process that's very labor-intensive and entails the use of metallic substrates to host layers of chemical and physical reactions, eventually producing a direct positive photographic image. So specifically, the process entails coating metal plates with a substance called collodion, which is liquid nitrocellulose mixed with 2 halogen salts, cadmium bromide and ammonium bromide. These plates are placed in a silver nitrate bath, where a chemical reaction turns the halogen salts into 2 photosensitive silver salts, silver bromide and silver iodide. The plates are then exposed and developed. And so we're projecting some examples of tintypes now. And the resulting prints have unique visual qualities. To contemporary audiences like us, they might appear strangely familiar, like unmistakably photographic, but also alteric, distinct enough from the types of images most commonly circulated today to interrupt habitual consumption. And when we say that they're unmistakably photographic, we mean that they do things that we expect photographs to do. They constitute resemblances or similitude. But even more importantly to us, they have visual qualities that are uniquely inherent to the photograph as a category of object. So to clarify this idea, on screen now is a Gerhard Richter painting that some of you probably recognize. What is perhaps most interesting about the painting is that it is very clearly a painting of a photograph. It has a grain and blurriness native not to empirically observed reality, but rather to photographic impressions of reality. Richter would not have painted the way he did before photography, and there are explicit qualities in the painting that are meant to leverage our familiarity with the way photographs render their subject matter. In doing so, the painting challenges media specificities and routinized modes of spectatorship. So we will return to those ideas at the end of our presentation because we're trying to do some similar things with our images. And tintypes also have unique physical properties. As you might be able to glean from this slide, but hopefully you would be able to glean it better from the pieces in the gallery, tintypes have a kind of texture and depth and thickness that give them heightened material presence, especially as compared to the typical 5x7 snapshot or the ephemeral digital pic. So in summary, tintypes are interesting to us because we see them as image objects that evince familiar photographic effects while stubbornly refusing to cede their object quality to the realm of mere appearances.
So our tintypes have been produced within an enormous occupiable camera that we called the conditions room, a fully functional sliding box camera with a lens and an operable focal length that was also designed to serve as a darkroom for the development of the images it captures and to open up to become a gallery space for exhibition. The conditions room is itself a study of the material and spatial consequences of image making, engaging a long history of optical devices that render the process of image making materially and spatially palpable. It's built from dimensional lumber and clad in closed-cell neoprene foam paneling, a material chosen for its unique light-canceling properties. And particular attention was paid to the design and fabrication of the paneling details, which are purposely over-articulated. They include a lot of double folds and redundancy to elevate the functional necessity of maintaining the precise light qualities required for our imaging process to the level of architectural expression. In this sense, we see our details almost as a kind of system of ornament. Aluminum reproductions of these details or ornaments serve as the substrates for the final products of this phase of our project. These substrates have been photosensitized through the tintype process, producing three-dimensional pieces displaying photographic impressions of digitally manipulated material textures. And we're really interested in the relationships that emerged between the digital patterns we produced and the material consequences of the tintype process. Sometimes both produced inconsistencies, blurs, or noise that appear surprisingly congruent, while at other times the slick and seamless digital is in stark contrast to the physical and material constraints of our imaging process.
So in one sense, we've thought of these pieces as being kind of Instagram ready, designed to insert themselves within the deluge of image circulation that sets the tempo for contemporary cultural production. But in another sense, our pieces are meant to resist habitual consumption. So as in the Richter painting we showed before, the pieces are meant to challenge media specificities and routinized modes of spectatorship by confusing the flat and the thick, the 2D and the 3D, the digital and the archaic. And so in this way, we hope to kind of check, disrupt, or redirect and slow down image circulation to secure moments of rare attention. So we'll end the presentation of this project with just some shots of the conditions room, opened up to serve as an exhibition space for viewing of the image objects, which kind of got the reproductions of the details of the conditions room themselves, so they got placed in the location where those details are in the paneling.
So this next project, Lossy Lossless, was a temporary environment for a nonprofit arts organization called Materials and Applications in Los Angeles. The project uses a public storefront space as a site through which to vivify the changing urban image of the surrounding neighborhood. We thought of our design for the storefront space as a kind of thick, layered tableau in which image and object, inhabitant and passerby mix and mingle as a part of a condensed community reflection. And when M&A approached us about this project, they explained that we would be the soft opening of their new space on Sunset Boulevard in Echo Park, and that our installation would be programmed with various community activities throughout its duration. And this directed our attention to the urban context. It was interesting to us that this new space on Sunset is located in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. This seemed to set up a complex problematic, given that M&A's mission centers on public engagement through art and architecture.
So our project was intended to provide a kind of forum for discussion of the politics and stakes surrounding the neighborhood's changing urban image. To do this, we wanted the storefront to feel like an extension of the street and a space that's meant to be viewed from the outside by the passerby, kind of like a diorama, as much as it is meant to be occupied. So we began with a kind of Google Street View analysis, moving up and down Sunset to gather what we saw as markers of the boulevard's past and future, fading remnants like the stacked tires around the flat fix that was next door, and abandoned phone booths, as well as things that we saw as markers of change, like the folding chalkboard placards that are outside of bougie cafes and ATMs and bike lane signs. So here are those kinds of elements which we gathered. So these elements were then digitally modeled and recombined in the wall covering that lines the space. Some elements appear ghostly and translucent, like they are in the act of disappearance, while others were purposely pixelated, which we thought of as a kind of a trait of digital loss. The wall covering was printed on a reflective material so that as one looks through the storefront, the exterior street life is reflected amidst the wall covering elements, again blurring inside and outside and figuring the kind of present urban public into this image of the boulevard.
Filling the rest of the space is a mutably occupiable floorscape assembled from an off-the-shelf data center floor system and covered with custom-made high-density foam padding. Meant to vivify the materiality of the digital world, we chose a data center floor composed of clearly defined tectonic elements so that the object quality of the floor elements would prompt comparative relationships with the objects depicted in the surrounding wall covering. Combined with the traffic cones, foam tiles, and furniture pieces distributed throughout the space, we hoped for a reading of objects spilling out from the walls onto the sidewalk, even while the walls collect objects from the street. The wall covering, the storefront space, the glass, and the reflected exterior street life were all considered material components within a thickened image of Sunset Boulevard on the cusp of change. We also had a local neon fabricator fabricate custom pieces for the installation. Here you can see the reflection on the glass of the street and then the sort of blurrier reflection on the interior. And then how the data center floor system sort of allows for different forms of occupation.
And again, we were really interested in the kind of tectonic articulation of the componentry of the data center floor elements and the way that kind of expressing those elements turned the elements themselves into objects that then blended with the other objects in the space and the objects depicted in the wall covering. These are just some shots from the opening, the way that the space became kind of saturated with green when the overhead lights were off. And we also anticipated that the project would have a kind of extended life online through social media. So the space is in kind of a constant state of flux. So each image presents a different combination of environmental conditions and kind of bodily relationships on the flooring system. And so quickly, this idea of experimentation into the materiality of the digital, be it the material stuff of images or less considered infrastructural componentry like cable, extends into a lot of our projects, such as our installation for Cyrus's Architecture League Prize this year, which is on which side for you?
On your right side.
Or this project in the middle, which was a project about internet equity and urban design in Detroit, or the thing all the way on the left, which is a light we designed called the extension cord.
Or this project from earlier in our partnership called Turn On, Tune In, a pavilion designed for the Toronto lakefront that was meant to illuminate our collective desensitization to media by repurposing the material stuff of media technology. We proposed a tube steel frame sheathed in overstocked or recycled polarizing film manufactured for use in LCD television screens. We discovered that manipulating the direction of tiled sheets of polarizing film creates areas of light and dark by bending light through one layer and then either allowing it to pass through or capturing it based on the orientation of the second layer. By then laminating acetate shapes between these layers, we found that we were able to reflect captured light to produce kaleidoscopic optical effects that constantly shift that constantly shift with one's vantage, changing seasonal conditions and weather. The ziggurat-like geometry of the pavilion is a result of tiling and layering the shape of a conventional 16:9 screen. And our hope was that this proportion would remain legible to visitors, perhaps a bit strangely familiar, so that the 16:9 rectangle, so often a marker of passive viewing, is transformed into an interactive display of effects engaging the surrounding environment and other viewers.
So this is a bit of a jump, but we were asked to include some student work too. So finally, we'll end with a couple examples of student work that, in a way, kind of related to our own work, is trying to use the digital image as a material thing. So it's probably not apparent from what we presented here so far, but we actually both teach in the urban design sequence at Taubman College as well. And these are examples from an exercise we both use in urban design courses separately. And the exercise asks students to take a 1 by 1 mile Google Earth aerial image of an existing city and to propose a kind of radical urban design scenario by only reorganizing and resampling the pixels in the image. Any piece of visual information present in the original aerial image can be kind of copied, mirrored, rotated, etc., but absolutely nothing can be imported. A couple more examples. So part of the goal is, of course, to think about the aerial image as an entity that can be manipulated and authored through techniques more native to what we conventionally think of as the material world. But maybe the larger goal is to begin to think about how urbanism might appear differently if it assumed as its base the technologies that will grow to become the most instrumental in the management and control of urban life, and those image matters that are now complexly intertwined with the built environment. So we'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could ask all the presenters to join us up front, as well as the interrogators who will provide some additional questions, that would be great. Yes. You can mix the measurements. So thank you. Let's wait for the microphone. Okay. Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. In a moment, I'll hand it over to our interrogators to come up with their questions and provide some additional insights as to how these talks can tie together. Before that, I will maybe offer just a brief comment and maybe a question that can start the conversation. One is that as far as I can see in these presentations, there is an immense layering of the digital images, the layering of different processes through which one develops both a two-dimensional image, a rendering, a photograph, and eventually an architectural spatial piece. And that kind of layering ranges from Jonathan's performative explorations, where there is a sense of performance of a material, be it a single tile or maybe a building itself, peeking into the party, into the house. Moving on to Chandler's sense of representational layering, pushing the boundary of the drawing in a very sort of a traditional sense of architectural representation being probably the key word for that layering. And then Hans, in his presentation, talked about really, I would say, historical layering and how you position this kind of production between different layers of historical avant-garde movements, and how do we reposition ourselves in that kind of trajectory. Constance appropriately saw decoys are probably the best way to describe your layering, the use of both shapes and images that stand for something completely different as a way to lead to how we can think about architecture differently. And for Patricia, it was a sense of interdisciplinary work where one moves through layers of different interdisciplinary inquiries to produce a particular piece as a sort of as an experience. And finally, for McLain and Cyrus, I think it was interesting to see how a photographic process, both as a print but also as an optical device, leads through sort of a layered process, how one can think about a building, but also how you showed also in the case of your student work, how it can lead to an urban idea as a city or an urban design program. So with all those layering in mind, I am actually curious to ask a question. How will that lead to a different way of building and making architecture? And that's a particularly interesting question because I feel we are in a monument to both classicism and modernism, both here in the Vale Hall and in the Kemper. It's a celebration of a certain sort of classically modern tradition that still seems to be relevant today, both as an idea and as a social mission. So if you take this current discourse and look at it as a way of a projective future, how we build about buildings, what do you think, how will the buildings be produced, rendered, and built differently than what we might call a classical or a modern tradition? Not everybody has to respond, but maybe a couple of you can address that before we move on to the next question.
Hans, you first. Okay, there we go. I guess I was just reminded of the famous Frederick Jameson quote from Postmodernism and the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, where he says that, you know, many are the postmodern buildings that are designed for color photography. And I do wonder if many of the contemporary image-centric practices will be designing to the speed of a different kind of photography and image circulation, one that's much faster and circulates more quickly. So that's just a quick thought off the cuff.
Thank you. Any iconic buildings from that kind of discourse that come to mind? I'm curious, since you mentioned Jameson as a kind of a theoretical icon of that discourse, what kind of buildings, contemporary buildings, I can speak?
Sure. I mean, I think like buildings that they're few and far between, but buildings that explicitly engage in things like texture mapping, one thinks of like the MVRDV Art Barn is like a kind of example, but I feel like it's probably in a lot of our image banks as we develop, syllabi
you? I have a question for you in response to your thoughts. When we were looking at McLain and Cyrus's last project of their students, I kept thinking how those were images that were really made from the point of view of drone photography. And so you were talking about perhaps building for a new kind of photography. So do you have any ideas about that?
I think I should punt that to Cyrus and McLain.
Okay, thank you.
Was that it was a question for us in the end then? Yeah, I think that those projects are thinking about that. They're, those are very quick urban design exercises, but to think about the way digital technologies, things like the drone photography or remote sensing technologies, things like that that are pervasive now in cities and in digital culture, might revise received tenets of urban design like legibility and the way we navigate cities and live in cities. I think that there's a kind of faith in that exercise that actually working through the image as a material thing might start to unlock some of those kinds of futures. But it is a very, very quick introductory exercise, but it's an idea that I think we think about in the practice quite a bit.
And I'd like to respond to Igor's question. I'm not in a position to really comment on the future of architecture, but I have been on a number of planning committees for new buildings. And it's striking how a certain percentage of the budget is usually allocated now for art or some kind of, for example, living wall in the building. And I see this as a kind of maybe it's a multi-purpose motivation behind the kinds of works that go into these buildings. But Paul Virilio wrote a terrific book called The Aesthetics of Disappearance on the speed of living in a digital world. And actually, Lutz Kopnick wrote a great book on slowness. So I see actually some of these interior spaces being fabricated for the purpose of actually slowing down. So I think it's something that, in the case of Dark Skies, which is, I've been invited to do several, interior architecture projects. It both slows people, it slows down the occupier of that space while proposing a kind of natural environment that could only be produced digitally. So that's how I would comment on the way that maybe the future of interiors might be developed.
I can pick up on your question too, Igor, because I think I agree with Hans, but I think I would extend it a little bit more. Like, we're here to talk about imaging as a kind of disciplinary and architectural discourse in part, but imaging is also a pervasive cultural discourse. It's not doesn't belong to architecture alone per se. I think that's very much what John May is actually trying to say in his piece, is that the modes of thought and the epistemologies of orthography are being replaced by something that is altogether different. And while I have arguments also with that essay sometimes, I think like that, for me, that's the interesting outcome or upshot, is that architecture now has perhaps at its grasp a kind of technique that has cultural cachet that might open up new contexts for engagement for architecture, that it might help to constitute our engagement of a digital sphere that goes between the material and the digital, that again is a kind of cultural context for architecture. We might have impact in the outside world.
Give an example.
So naive, or not naive, I'll say an example of trying is the project that we showed, Lossy Lossless, that is trying to create kind of transmedial effects. It's trying to make architecture or a space that moves between something that is explicitly imagistic and something that's object-like, and it's trying to recommend itself into things like Instagram. So it's trying to insert itself into that kind of circulation of image as a cultural context. I don't think it's changing the world yet, but it's trying to experiment with techniques to do just that.
I see. I ask that because there's just an incredible amount of material got put on the table very quickly. So I think it's going to be very difficult for this. We have, 3 hours to do this?
4.5.
But so I think we have to generalize drastically just to kind of say anything. But I asked the question because a lot of definitions of the image were put on the table. Like Constance had a whole screen of them that I couldn't see, but my eyes are bad now. But one definition that I didn't see, which I think would help this conversation, kind of comes out of really 1950s art discourse and philosophy. So going back and looking at Ernst Gombrich's writing on the image, or Suzanne Langer's philosophical writing on the image, or even Rainer Banham's appropriation of some of those dialogues in the 1950s. And each of them boiled down, I would say, the image is what's left behind after everything else falls away in an aesthetic experience. The image is experiential, it's psychological in that discourse, that it's kind of the shadow burned into your brain after a significant aesthetic experience in that sense. And I think that kind of image talk I didn't see any of today, although it was really rampant through certain phases of mid-century modernism. The flip side is that the kind of image talk that I did see quite a bit of really seems to be very deeply invested in conversations about drawing that go back in architecture over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, which have to do with technologies of inscription and recording and representation. And I think that tension between image in its kind of, let's say, art historical sense, and image in its kind of technographic sense is important to put on the table in this conversation. And I wonder how much any of the presenters might see that line of questioning and infecting the sorts of things you said.
One of the things that I think Nicole and I are after as well is the relationship between the collections of images or photographs that we found and its relationship to the production of or translation of an architecture. And so what we didn't show today was an exhibition based off the photographs and the building codes of New Glorious, and that were basically of Swiss chalets and its relationship to a kind of aspiration towards Swissness for the town. And so in there is an example of people who are maybe not so much invested in architecture, or even maybe they may have come from Switzerland originally in New Glorious, but there is a way to start to understand this kind of collection. And this is something we're trying to figure out in our practice, how these collections of photographs start to produce a kind of new form of architecture, or familiar architecture, or something that's not quite familiar.
And it seems like, as you were talking about that distinction, what I kept thinking of was kind of the affective quality. And Patricia, you were starting to talk about that, and it's how we perceive. So as you're thinking of developing the image, how do you connect with the people who are perceiving the building, or the project, or the artwork, whatever it may be? I think the idea of technique is also one that you're trying to bring someone along on that process of how the image is made, or trying to kind of find a new way to reach them. And sometimes technique is just a vehicle that can kind of pull out of the existing body of knowledge into a new context. That in a way it could be just jarring enough that the overall kind of effect that gets created from it hopefully can generate kind of a sense of mood, or affect a way a person perceives it in some way. I think that's, I saw with the video, it starts to affect the way that people move and their body interacts with it. And so maybe that's one way that we could begin to kind of think about how the image gets burned into your brain, right? It's that memory of the experience.
Yeah, no, I think for me that's the most powerful impact. I thought that the work that Patricia showed was absolutely mind-blowing, like really great. And I some of the line work that gets produced in the kind of those hostage pens on the CNC, like I feel badly for the pen, but I'm happy about the lines that get produced. But the thing is that for me in every case, already I've forgotten most of what I just saw, right? I've forgotten all of your footnotes, even though there were tons of them. But the thing is, what sticks in the brain are certain aspects of the projects, right? Those pieces that exceed the history of its making, that actually carry forward into the future, not as a kind of remembrance of the technique or the history of the production, but rather as a kind of, they stick in a very different way. And I think they do begin to suggest, like, I live in the world just a little bit differently now. Not because I know something about night sounds or the tongue of a mouse, because I don't. But I think I do wind up with a consciousness of scale that is different. And so, there's a kind of slippage between, knowledge of the process, a very kind of academic knowledge of the process, where there will be a test later and we're going to see how much you remembered, and a kind of experiential kind of hangover, let's say. Something kind of sticks with you and manipulates your being in a way. And I feel a little bit that a lot of the work that we saw today is very much hung up on a kind of academic documentation, and which is great for a crowd like this. Is mostly other people who make stuff. So seeing how you make this stuff is really great. But I do want to kind of like turn the conversation a little bit toward what happens in the future of this work, as opposed to how does this work remind us to look back at the past of its own making.
And maybe I'll just follow up on that. That was terrific set of things to contemplate. But I wonder too if part of what you just said makes me wonder about whether or not we should also discuss the kind of ocular-centric tendencies, which of course come with looking at images. There was a great arts writer, Meredith Tromble, who wrote about dark skies, and she wrote about it. She spent 3 hours in the gallery and wrote about it about 3 months later. And what she ended up writing about was the sound.
Yeah.
So, we're inserting these images into a world that is a multisensory world. So there are other aspects of viewing and experiencing and having an embodied experience of an image that go beyond simply ocular-centric kind of tendencies. So I'll throw that out there for anybody who'd like to comment.
I'll just say one quick thing, which is, I think in the kind of, like you were talking about, the experiential hangover of these image experiences, I feel a certain frustration in the academy, conducting seminars on kind of, formalism in 2 dimensions, in that we still are so heavily indebted to Gestalt psychology, phenomenology, and affect theory to give any kind of semblance of rigor to talking about those experiences and that embodied hangover, whatever you want to call it. And at this point, I think those theoretical models are not just like decades out of date, but no longer adequate to deal with the speed and the techniques that we're using to develop new image experiences. That's just a complaint.
There's also an interesting twist that's also classical, because the dominion of the eye and the optical goes back to the Renaissance. It's a very modern, very classical model at the same time, as much as being a postmodern, model that's image-based as well. So I want to give a chance to Shantel to ask a question.
I'm just going to briefly ask a question because I'm so fascinated by listening to you talk about what you've done. So as a historian, I kind of am working with a set of sort of conceptual tools that are somewhat old, I guess, like not quite as old as Langer and Gombrich, but perhaps equally outdated with respect to the reality we are living in. And one of the things I think is fascinating about this work is that it seems to be ahead somehow of the written discourse. So I'm really glad that Igor led with this sort of very practical question of how can this make architecture? Because I was scared to ask that question myself. Because in a way, what I want to know is what's the potential for image as like a category that is somewhat autonomous from design, decoration, and some sort of standard categories of architecture. So what I'm interested to hear about, I guess, is what is your sense of the potential of image in its autonomy from other categories for the future? And I'm not going to say the future of architecture, but maybe the future of experience or, for example, in Constance and Patricia's work, seems to be a sort of way in which you're kind of offering a way to make sense of one's place in the world, like this small person in a bigger scale. And then in some other projects, like in Hans's project, I really love this sort of idea of this miniature world. At least that's what it looked like to me in the representations that were shown. So those are two possibilities, following a kind of cybernetic model of like using technology as a tool to situate oneself somehow. But I also really loved, in particular, maybe to start by asking someone specific a question, Jonathan's project, which when you showed the house, where you really used the procedure to come up with a kind of, method for applying color to the house. The house itself seemed not to challenge conventional architecture very strongly. So there's a way in which your project is kind of going way ahead or way beyond, but also I would suggest maintaining a kind of autonomy precisely by not challenging standard details. Is that right?
Well, one of the things that Nicole and I were after with the house was not just thinking about the outer house as being purely built off of the photograph, but also based off of a typical understanding of the typical tract house that's in the neighborhood. And so we were also interested in, even though these things may not be so iconic, that the cabin that was on the site was important to us as well, that log cabin. And so trying to find ways to engage with the things that were there were important to us, and the result was a kind of ensemble, to use Dean Colangelo's term, of these kind of familiar things.
But what's funny about that project, for all the talk of conjuring it out of the context, right? And so we sort of scan the visual field of the surroundings and turn it into colors and blah, blah. What winds up getting put into the context doesn't fit. Like for me, what's important about the project is that exactly what you start out to accomplish doesn't happen. And if it did, it would be worse. You know, that you produce, it's very similar to the way that Patricia's project works as well, is that you gather a massive amount of information, but it gets translated through the medium you're working with into a different kind of effect. In your case, a very clear kind of spatial and scalar intensification, you might say. And so, and that's what I think, again, it comes back to the kind of, there's a, for all the talk of a slippage between objects and images, there's an incredible stability of ideas to projects that is not, that everyone seems to have presented them with, A plus B equals C, and there is no ambiguity to that. And I think it's an interesting symptom to look at. But because in fact, where each of the projects becomes most interesting is when they kind of produce effects that weren't predicted, or they begin to leave behind their source material, to produce a different kind of possibility. And that's where I think the work can stop being, it can stop being kind of, God, what's the word? A lot of the work is beholden to its backstory. And I think to let go of the backstory a little bit, that's where the work really gets, so when I find this very odd thing in the forest, and the colors kind of resonate, but they also don't in that because the weather conditions have changed and now it's winter, like any number of things have happened. And so it begins to tell me something not about the kind of stability of the context, but the totally fleeting nature of phenomenology, right? Like that every experience, Heraclitan flux and all of that stuff, And so I think that there's a moment in each one of these, like I kind of wanted to be at the midterm to kind of tweak the alibis a little bit, because the alibis seem, I think it's very important to begin with those kind of, I'm going to try this out and see where it goes, but I think it's equally important to be able to let go of those initial, those initial ambitions, right? Andy Zago used to call that achieving escape velocity from your own ideas, that you kind of, that the project goes somewhere else. And I think each of these works have gone somewhere else in a way that is super promising. But at the same time, I feel like that in some way they're still tethered back to these kind of, to the launching pad, in a way.
Well, in that vein, I guess you're saying that because each project seems to start with an image as like the underlying groundwork, or many of them do, that then shifts into different material realities beyond its original one housed in the hardware of a computer. So does that is that negated for you because of the ultimate output and its effects, that it doesn't matter what the starting point is? That's your stance?
I think it matters for you.
Right.
It doesn't matter for me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter for your audience. And I think one of the tricks is that, you're addressing a lot of constituencies who are coming at it from a very different background. So in a way, this is an answer to Igor's initial question. How does this turn into architecture when it's able to be out in the world on its own without a docent? You know what I mean?
Well, I think they're able to be out in the world on their own in really significant ways because of their imageable qualities. And maybe that's what you're getting to, where things are made to enter Instagram, that they have color and decals embedded in them, that they're starting to tie into visual culture and pull attention in different ways, as Patricia was talking about in her work with slowness. So perhaps the grounds and the trajectory of things are something that we could contest, although I still think it's like, I don't think it's just technique that's being talked about.
No, I agree. And so let me try to restate it a little bit differently. I think that somewhere embedded in the whole conference is a difference between ontology and phenomenology, right? Objects are, and images seem, right? And so if ontology is the study of being and phenomenology is the study of seeming, this whole conference is about the gap between those two things. And the way it's played out so far is that the objects they can be understood. Like, I know what the object is. This is a pencil, right? Its effects are more fleeting. But the fact of the matter is that we can't actually know the object, right? That naive realism has been telling us since, 3,000 years ago that we don't have that kind of confident access to the object. It's not available. There's always more there, right? And I think a lot of these objects were presented as, it is the idea in a sense, but in fact it always exceeds. So really we can only work on that kind of fleeting phenomenological side, that this part is always incomplete, this part is always in flux. And I think that there's an illusion of completeness in some of the presentations. And I think in some ways you can't not do that. But I'm trying to kind of shift the conversation over to I'd like to hear more about the experience and possibilities that have been discovered than about the kind of apparatus of production.
I mean, maybe sorry.
No, yeah, I would just say that I think that would be a great goal for the conference. Because I think that would be a great goal for the conference. I think a lot of what was presented are designers trying to struggle with the what is it of image objects, like exactly that. And I think that, I don't know, speaking for our work, especially like the plates that we made in the first project, Image Matters, it would be, for me, it's a disappointment if someone were to walk up to it and say, like, how was it made?
Yeah.
We want someone to say, what is it?
Right.
We want it to have like exactly that kind of quality that you're talking about. But then getting back to something that you said before, I think that the conversation is also a little bit hamstrung by a lack of definitions around image. Because if we begin from the basis of techniques, like the how was it made, what are its technical bases is foundational. Like everyone's talking about John May's piece, and that's what that is about. Like it is.
Well, and that's why I wanted to shift it to.
It's very different from a what is it kind of phenomenological object in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Just to tag on to that, I think we need to remember that phenomenology, I mean, there's not one phenomenology either. I mean, Deleuze and Spinoza talked about the kind of combination of this sort of emotional and psychological aspects of affect, while, other aspects of that are spatial temporal. So, affect is not one thing, phenomenology is not one thing. So it's also a very, multifaceted, layered, way of existing in relationship to the environment around us. Just to give phenomenology a little bit of a bump up. Boop.
No, I mean, phenomenology has been kind of smacked down for a long time, and I think for a lot of right reasons, but a lot of really important possibilities are left behind in the process. I mean, because the fact of the matter is ontology is also always a little bit more than you thought, as I think the mouse tongue shows, right? It doesn't matter if I know that comes from a mouse tongue in some way when I go see it. Right. But discovering that later, you're like, wow, there's even more, like you scratch and you keep discovering more possibilities. Right. And so I guess partly this is a sort of rhetorical request that I'm making to the architects in the room, which is to hold a little bit back. Don't be so honest. Because the seductive qualities of the work, I think, are strong enough to command the room, and they don't need an alibi, as interesting as some of the alibis have been.
Just say one quick note on phenomenology, which is, it may have been discredited decades ago in architectural discourse, but it's very much a live operative method in art discourse, and that has to do with the particular phenomenologists that both camps endorse, namely German and French. But that never seemed to be as much of a problem in art discourse.
It would be nice for me if we could get out of the whole category labeling conversation altogether. I mean, I think that there is the tendency to attach things to various ologies and isms and iddies. I think it becomes limiting because it really does it limits you to a certain kind of conversation, which in certain contexts is quite useful to have. But I think also it does draw you back into, you tend to be inside and speaking into a microphone when you're using those kinds of terms. And I'm really interested in the possibility of architecture's stories not being so insular and terminologically technical.
Thanks. Maybe on that broader note, we can wrap up the morning session. One of my thankless tasks as a moderator to try to keep us on schedule, and we are only about 25 minutes behind, which is not too bad for the first session. But I hope you will all come back for the afternoon sessions that start at 2 o'clock over here. And we're also hoping that the afternoon format will allow us to engage the audience even more in the questions and the dialogue. So thanks again to all of our presenters this morning, as well as the interrogators for the job well done. Thank you.